Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Outdoor Recreation Knowledge Exchange between Wyoming and Colorado. We're pretty excited to have you here today to join us for our final webinar of this series, but don't worry, we'll have some more. We just got to rethink about what we're doing and bring in some more partners. My name is Guinevere Nelson, and I'm with Colorado State University Extension, and I will be your moderator today. This webinar is a series of partnerships between the Colorado State University Extension, the Colorado Office of Outdoor Recreation, the University of Wyoming Extension, and the J. Kemmerer Worth Institute, and the Wyoming Outdoor Recreation Office. As you know, this is our final one, and it's been such a great experience, and I'm just so appreciative of everybody who's participated. And I'm also delighted about the knowledge that I personally have gained and the new connections that have been forged through this series. I hope it's been a great experience for you all, whether this is your first or fifth webinar with us. As you probably know, if you've been to a few of these, I have Haley Sorg, who is going to serve as our co-creator and co-host of this series. Her role today will be monitoring the Q&A chat, providing links to our in-webinar polls, and answering questions. So if you guys do have questions, you'll notice that the chat is just a Q&A chat and not generally to everybody. So if you can't hear or you need something repeated or have questions, please use that Q&A chat. Also, as this is our last webinar, if you guys have feedback or ideas for the next presentation series that you'd like to see us address, please put those in there and we'll try to incorporate those in our next iteration. I'm so thrilled to learn from our panelists today about the future of the economy, the people, and the wild places that support outdoor recreation. We all know it's difficult to know how the future will unfold, but our speakers today bring regional, statewide, and national perspectives, and our aim in inviting them here is to provide you with a forecast as best we can for your future outdoor recreation goals. I'm going to hit the next. I'm going to share my screen now. Yes. You looking good out there, Haley? Okay, great. So let me see. It's not moving forward. Okay, here we go. This is our agenda today. This is the welcome portion, and then we'll have a polling question and then panelist presentations, and we'll go through 4 of each of those, and then we'll have a Q&A. Some of you submitted questions with your registration, and we've done our best to incorporate those into the Q&A session. Again, if you have burning questions that arise throughout the presentation, please put those in the Q&A chat, and Haley will pass them along. Let's see, with that, I'm excited to present or announce our speakers. Chris Perkins with the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, Jeff Derry with the Center for Snow and Avalanche Studies, Courtney Larson with the Nature Conservancy, and Angela Boag with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Here is our first polling question, and this is one that we want to learn from you, which is, what are you hoping to get out of this webinar? Haley has posted that in the chat. We also can take a picture with your smartphone of this QR code. I'll give you a couple minutes as we bring on Chris Perkins. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Chris, if you want to go ahead. And well, let me introduce you. Chris Perkins is the Vice President of Programs for Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, and he'll be sharing his slides. So just give me a second to stop sharing and then him to share his.
Thanks, Guinevere.
Yeah.
I did take a moment to answer the survey question myself, because I'm really looking forward to hearing from my esteemed colleagues on the call, and just very grateful to be here. I live in Wyoming. I live in Jackson. We were commiserating before the call about just how cold it is in the Mountain West today. And in the winter, it's such an important time to reflect on things like the snowpack and the ski season, its implications on wildfire and the summer ahead. So I'm happy to get done with my bit and hear from these experts. What I hope to do is set the table for today's conversation by talking about the state of the outdoor recreation economy nationwide through the lens we take at ORR. And that starts with the news. The first thing I do every day, ideally before my kids wake up, who are 1 and 3, is read the news. And if you, like me, have been reading the news related to outdoor recreation in the past few years, particularly since the pandemic, you know that something is different now nationwide than it was before. Communities of all sizes and state leaders across the political spectrum are investing in outdoor recreation infrastructure and access like never before. And so, my hope in this table setting part of today's conversation is to talk about some of the reasons that these leaders and communities are doing that and what learnings we might take into the future of the outdoor recreation economy. And one of those success stories has been here in Wyoming, where state legislators last year and then Governor Gordon created a new outdoor recreation trust fund. And that was really made possible by the recreation and conservation communities coming together to talk about the importance of outdoor recreation for the state. A big part of this, of course, is the recognition that outdoor recreation improves quality of life. In fact, when you talk to economic development professionals around the country, there's an increased recognition that quality of life investments versus traditional business-friendly measures are having a greater impact on economic development outcomes in communities, and outdoor recreation infrastructure and access are an increasing part of that quality of life lens, especially in an era where people are more mobile than ever before. Remote and hybrid work is more accessible. People are moving to and visiting places that have great access to the outdoors. This is exciting for the benefits that outdoor recreation provides, but it also has big questions and implications about how we relate to land and water and with wildlife. In my role as the Vice President of Programs at the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, we bring together all the organizations you see here, which really represent the full spectrum of outdoor recreation activities, from hiking, biking, skiing, and climbing to hunting, fishing, boating, motorized RV, hospitality, horseback riding, you name it. Two of those members are the Colorado Office of Outdoor Recreation, the Wyoming Office of Outdoor Recreation, as well as the J. Kemmerer Worth Institute at the University of Wyoming. And this forum enables us to talk about shared issues across the outdoor recreation economy, as well as to really speak with a unified voice with leaders at the state and federal level about why outdoor recreation is good for society, good for the economy, and worthy of future investment. And in that quest, I should say there's a lot of ways we can talk about the benefits of time outside. It's kind of like spiritual benefits, cultural benefits, community benefits. And all those are important. We found a lot of traction with policymakers when we talk about the economic benefits of outdoor recreation. So I want to talk briefly about what we mean when we say the term outdoor recreation economy. And so the first main question is like, where can outdoor recreation occur? And of course, it can be in places that are far from home, like in the photo on the left in the Grand Canyon, where you might travel hours or have to float down the Colorado River to find access to spaces like these. But it can also occur just minutes from one's front door in a more urban setting, and the benefits that we experience accrue in both places. And when you have a sense of where outdoor recreation can occur, you also start to think about the sort of organizations that contribute to the outdoor recreation economy. And so this graphic from the Oregon State University Center for the Outdoor Recreation Economy is quite helpful in outlining the private sector, so the manufacturing businesses, retail businesses, guides and outfitters who help people get outdoors, the public sector, whether that be local, state, and federal agencies, tribal nations, community economic development groups, or the nonprofit sector like community groups, Service Corps, advocacy, and trade associations. All these organizations working together in unison to help people have high quality experiences in the outdoors. And of course, none of those efforts are successful without healthy public lands and waters that supply access to outdoor recreation. Of course, private lands and waters can help as well, but generally public lands and waters. When you look at the scale of this economy nationwide, it's enormous. The U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis measures the economic impact of outdoor recreation every year. These are the most recent numbers from 2023. $1.2 trillion in economic output to the United States, 2.3% of U.S. GDP, 5 million jobs, and over 3% of employment, growing faster than the U.S. economy as a whole over the past year. And the BEA drills down these figures at the state level as well. So you can learn about Colorado, Wyoming, and all the other Western states. On this map here, you see the percentage of GDP that comes from outdoor recreation in each state. And it stands out even more when you compare this to other traditional large industries. Outdoor recreation's economic impact exceeds that of industries like utilities, mining, computer electronic products, agriculture, and oil and gas. And so to get back to the frame that we take to our work, it's really this economic impact that opens the doors with policymakers and leaders, and then offers the opportunity to talk about benefits and opportunities for outdoor recreation through different lenses, depending on the values of that policymaker. I want to tell a story from Utah, where they interviewed tech sector workers who were coming back to the state. And they said, you could go to any state to work in the tech industry. Why are you coming to Utah? And 85% of those surveyed said that the number one reason they were coming to Utah was access to the outdoors. And number two was family. And this is in Utah, which is a very family-friendly state. And when you combine that with data like these that show that recreation-dependent communities regained their job losses more quickly than others after the pandemic, you start to see why leaders across the country are seeing outdoor recreation as an important part of their economic development mix. And so that leads me to the final part of the presentation, where I want to talk about the rural economic development work that ORR has done. My first project with ORR in 2020 was to talk about how rural communities can tap in to the outdoor recreation economy in ways that are authentic to their values and histories, but also minimize unintended drawbacks and consequences related to highly desirable regions, things like affordability, housing, human-wildlife interactions, whatever it might be. And so that research was packaged in the first edition of the ORR Rural Economic Development Toolkit, and now a second edition that was published early last year. And when we published this research, we got outreach from almost every corner of the country, communities seeking to tap into outdoor recreation as a diversification strategy, particularly many who've been historically reliant on extractive industries like oil and gas or minerals and want to pivot into outdoor recreation as a tool for economic growth, but also community benefit. And so the goals of this research are first to define the process, how are rural communities tapping into this economy most successfully, how they're planning proactively around challenges related to outdoor rec economy development that I mentioned prior, and then also to spotlight great work. And that's captured in these 12 best practices. I'll put a link in the chat, but generally of the 70 communities that we interviewed for this research, these 12 best practices were evergreen no matter the geography or size or background of the community. And the research includes things such as a self-assessment tool so that a community can understand where they are and where they'd like to go in relation to outdoor recreation access and economic development, tools on accessibility to outdoor recreation, particularly for communities who've historically been excluded from outdoor recreation or underserved in outdoor rec access, tools on climate resilience, which we'll hear more about today, how communities can prepare in advance of the next natural disaster to be more insulated from those impacts, more resilient, and respond better. Perfect example of this is in Western North Carolina, of course, where the economy is extremely reliant on trail, boat, campground access, and was hit so hard by Hurricane Helene. I was actually speaking this morning to the North Carolina Director of Outdoor Rec about a new tool that we're going to create to talk about that immediate response to extreme weather and natural disasters. So we look forward to putting that out in the coming months. Also, tribal leadership, knowing that tribes are the original stewards of today's public lands and waters, and play an important role in managing these places for success. And I'm going to conclude my presentation there, knowing that we have so much good stuff in store. And I look forward to hearing the expertise of my fellow panelists as well as your Q&A in a little bit. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was really great framework for the rest of the conversation today. Thank you so much. Haley, do you want to sum up why people are joining us today and what they hope to get out of it?
Yes, thank you all for submitting your answers into our Menti question. Don't worry, there's going to be some other questions coming your way shortly. But a lot of the responses, what we're seeing is everyone's looking for a little deeper dive with these experts from around the country, more information about responsible outdoor recreation development, a lot of awareness of current events and future trends, any future facing information for outdoor recreation, and a lot of just here to learn and expand their knowledge on what to expect in the coming years for outdoor recreation.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's why I'm excited about this panel, so glad we're all on the same page. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and this is the second polling question, and Haley's got that in the chat already. Give you a few minutes. I like that some of the panelists are also adding to the chat, so thanks for that, or the mentee. All right, next on our presentation is Jeff Derry, and he's the Executive Director for the Center for Snow and Avalanche Studies out of Silverton, Colorado. And I'm going to go ahead and get your slide ready, and just go ahead whenever you're ready to tell me when to move on to the next one. I think you're still on mute, Jeff.
Let's go to the next one then.
Okay, great.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, like mentioned, we're in Silverton over here, just north of Durango by about an hour here in the San Juan Mountains. We do a number of things. Quick introduction to our organization. We do a number of things, and one of those is we have a study basin called Cinderbeck Study Basin up near Red Mountain Pass, just outside of town here. And in the study basin, we do long-term climate monitoring. We have highly instrumented climate stations that collect the entire energy budget of the snowpack. We monitor the snowpack as well on a very regular basis. And we host a lot of snow researchers who are studying the snowpack, developing new instrumentation or what have you. It runs the whole spectrum. And we are located pretty conveniently at the headwaters of about 5 major watersheds, from the Rio Grande to the Uncompahgre to the Animas going down towards the south, and the Dolores on the other side of the hill here. Next slide, please. And so we spend most of our time operating the Colorado Dust on Snow program. And this is where we monitor dust in the snowpack throughout the winter season. And the San Juans is a perfect place to do that. Next slide, please. So first off, why do we monitor the dust in the snowpack? First, we need to understand what melts the snow, and that is solar radiation. And as opposed to air temperature, which is a common misconception that a lot of folks think that the air temperature melts the snow, is actually solar radiation. And the biggest control on how much solar radiation is absorbed by the snowpack is defined by the albedo of the snowpack, or the reflectance of the snowpack, how shiny that snow surface is. A very shiny, fresh snow can reflect upwards to 90% of solar radiation back into space, whereas a dirty snowpack with dust on the surface or other impurities can absorb a lot more solar radiation, and that energy goes towards melting the snowpack. And here in Colorado, dust on the snow surface defines kind of how severe that albedo number might be. Like I mentioned, 90% can be reflected. Just to give you a comparison, water has an albedo of, at the most, about 10%, which means it's absorbing like 90% of that solar energy, which goes towards warming the water. And at the extreme is that clean snow surface when it's clean. So in a typical winter, if we're lucky, we get snow. A lot of times when those storms come in out of the desert Southwest, kind of the Four Corners region of northern Arizona, northern New Mexico, southern Utah, dust can get kicked up, mobilized, and trained into the storm systems, and they make their way to Colorado. And when they hit the Colorado mountains, particularly the San Juan Mountains, they dump the dust and snow, hopefully, and hopefully that dust gets buried with new snow accumulation. And that process goes on throughout the winter season, hopefully, or at least it gets snow, hopefully. And come springtime, when that first dust layer near the surface of the snowpack it reaches the surface, it melts the snow faster than it would have normally, and melts the snow down to the next dust layer, and where the two dust layers combine at the surface, merging at the surface, darkening the surface even more, and melting this, absorbing more solar radiation, and melting the snowpack faster down to the next dust layer, and so on and so forth, until all the dust layers have merged at the surface and greatly reducing albedo and greatly absorbing much more solar radiation than a clean snowpack. And that energy goes towards warming very rapidly the snowpack and melting very rapidly the snowpack. And as you might imagine, that affects the timing of snow melt, affects the rate of snow melt, and it even reduces overall total runoff yields. Next slide, please. To that point of reducing runoff yields, you can just imagine if the snow cover leaves the landscape. Studies have shown 3, 4, 5 weeks earlier due to dust than otherwise than normal. That early snow ablation exposes plants and soils earlier in the season, which in turn turns on evapotranspiration rates earlier in the season and evaporation from soils earlier in the season. And that's water that would otherwise go towards our streams and rivers. It's estimated that about 5% of the Upper Colorado River Basin stream flow is reduced because of dust playing a factor in reducing and depleting the snowpack so much earlier in the season. And for the purpose of this talk, you can just imagine, what an early ablation of the snow would do. I mean, everything from increased evapotranspiration rates to stress on vegetation. I know that in 2018, the snowpack was ablated so early in the season that a lot of vegetation near our study plots was exposed so early that frost killed a lot of vegetation, and that it didn't grow that summer. And then just another simple example, maybe critters who live in that subnivean space between the ground and snowpack, that space there, without that warm and insulated snowpack protecting them, that could really stress small critters who depend on the snowpack for warmth and shelter. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of timing and rate, this is one of my favorite slides to show folks. What we're seeing here is a plot of albedo, which is that red line, and that comes from our station data. That's a percentage. The higher the number, the more reflective the snowpack. And then that blue line is stream flow, right near our study basin as well. And so you can see, I use 2016 as an example here because that was a great year. In springtime, we would get a good snowstorm, and then about 7 days later, we get another snowstorm. So that really shows really nicely how albedo spikes up, a really reflective surface with a new snow accumulation, and stream flow goes down. And then over time, during that week, dust would slowly come to the surface, lowering the albedo, and then that would increase stream flow. And then so on and so forth throughout the whole springtime. And so you can just see the interplay of how albedo relates to stream flow. So if you showed me a plot of albedo, I could tell you what stream flows are doing, if they're going up or down. In terms of melt rates, it requires a little bit more calculation for each particular stream or watershed, but it really can really drastically spike melt rates, which would be allowing water to hit the snowmelt to hit the rivers much earlier in the season at a higher rate than normal, which you can just imagine repercussions of that as well. Next slide, please. So what we do, our organization, we in springtime, excuse me, March, April, and May, we tour the state, digging a lot of snow profiles, doing a lot of digging, and find the dust, know where it's at in the snowpack, and when it might come to the surface. Basically, giving recreationalists, water managers, the water community in general, an albedo forecast, which is essentially a forecast on stream flow, timing, and rates. And most of our sites are located around mountain passes to kind of capture that regional deposition of dust, again, from the desert Southwest mainly. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here's just a few more photos from recent years. There's in the middle photo there, the city of Aspen has a nasty dust layer in, I think, 2023. The thing about dust on snow is it's very visceral. You can just look at it and say, yep, that's got to be doing something to the snowpack. Might not be sure what, but it's doing something. And yeah, and the science has determined it's really doing a lot. Buttermilk ski area to the lower left there. That's 2 years ago as well. And the dust when the dust is like that, it really degrades the skiing quality. Kind of feels like you're skiing on sand, kind of gritty feeling when you're skiing. It can really make the snow surface really slushy to ski on, and of course going towards just melting the snow across the entire landscape much earlier. Let's see here, that upper left image is a satellite image of dust making its way during a snowstorm towards Colorado. And the dust is that magenta, kind of bright pink color you see coming out of northern Arizona, northern New Mexico, going towards the Colorado mountains. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, the majority, the big dust source for Colorado is the desert Southwest, Four Corners. There are other dust source areas for Colorado, such as the Chihuahuan Desert, the Great Basin, where around Vernal, Utah, is another potential dust source for more northern Colorado. But the Four Corners is definitely the biggest dust source. And so when those desert crusts, fragile desert crusts in the desert particularly get disturbed, they can be even more susceptible to being mobilized and entrained in these storms, and hence go to Colorado in wintertime. So land use and soil health is a big important factor in contributing to this. I intentionally show this photo here. This is a dust being mobilized in northern Arizona, and the picture was taken from a USGS guy in a commercial aircraft, and he saw this coming towards Colorado, so he took a picture. And I show this just to point out too, the dust itself is harmful to humans as it is, just the people who live in this region. And I imagine the wildlife isn't too thrilled about it either, So it has local repercussions as well as larger regional repercussions. Next slide, please. Just quickly to shift gears, just to mention this, not only does dust play a big factor and on the snowpack, but the recent trends is that we were receiving less snow in general. Some studies have shown that in the western U.S. over the last 40 years, the snowpack has diminished by about 41%. And the snow season shortened about 34 days, so a good month. Here in Colorado, studies have shown that the snowpack has declined between 20 to 60%, and that's a huge number looking at snow course data. So you can see a lot of variability, but the trends are, we're receiving less precipitation in wintertime. Next slide, please. Then, of course, we have a warming climate. And Colorado, along with mountain regions and polar regions, is seeing a climate warming up to 2 times greater than the rest of the planet. In Colorado, over the last 30 years, we've warmed 2 degrees. Just from 2000 to 2017, we've seen a warm up of 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a huge amount in such a short amount of time. And the recent studies have shown that we're seeing at least a 3 to 4% decline in annual runoff just for every 1 degree of warming. So just the atmosphere is getting thirstier, and it's just grabbing more moisture wherever it can. I won't spend too much time with any of those other plots because it's never ending. We can go on all day on those. Next slide, please. Maybe for time, I'll skip these next 2 slides. So forward again and forward one more time. Basically, my last slide, yesterday I was trying to make a last slide, and I was starting to list all the outdoor activities I can think of and how it might be affected by climate warming and dust on snow. And the list, it quickly became daunting. My slide was just out of control quickly. So maybe in the discussion today, we can dial in on more what people are concerned about or thinking about. But maybe just as a last plug, if you want to receive updates from about our dust on snow conditions, maybe easy way to do it is just Google Colorado dust on snow, and my information is in there. You can send me an email, and I'll add you to our mailing list, where I just put out a notice saying we posted an update to our website, and that's about it. So I will quit there.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. As you guys may know, both Colorado and Wyoming depend on a large portion of the outdoor economy and snow sports. And so we decided that this was a really important topic to tie to both themes in our state. So that's a great contribution to that statewide conversation. And it sounds like even Wyoming has some effects from dust on snow as well. So thank you for that. We're going to move into our next polling question, and we are always curious in Extension and the Worth Institute, what resources do you need to make your outdoor recreation efforts resilient in the future, which also ties to the theme of today. So go ahead and take a few minutes to answer that. And in the meantime, I'm going to pull up our next speaker, Courtney Larson, and she is the Wyoming conservation scientist with the Nature Conservancy. And just go ahead and take it away, Courtney, whenever you're ready.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for being here. My name is Courtney Larson. I'm a conservation scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Wyoming chapter based in Lander, Wyoming. Do you want to pull up my slides, Guinevere? There we go. Yeah. For about the last 13 years, I've been working on researching recreation impacts on wildlife. So that's really what I'm going to focus on today is the wildlife piece. Most of that research was while I was a grad student, but continuing to a lesser extent here at the Nature Conservancy. So I'm going to share some reflections on where we stand today in terms of our knowledge on recreation and wildlife, and then move into a few thoughts on, my thoughts on the future of outdoor recreation, especially with a wildlife lens. Next slide. Oh, that turns out funny colors. It wasn't that color in my screen, but okay, we'll roll with it. So when I first started working on this topic in 2012, I feel like the perception of this issue has really shifted. So when I told people about what I was going to be researching, the most common responses I would get were like doubt and confusion. Like, really? How damaging can someone walking in the woods really be? Next slide. And the first thing I worked on as a grad student was a literature review to assess the state of the science on recreation and wildlife, or recreation wildlife impacts. And our paper came out almost 10 years now. The literature on this topic had kind of just started to take off. And really the biggest thing that we were able to show with this paper was that, yes, recreation does have impacts on wildlife. That wasn't necessarily the consensus view at the time. And we were kind of just pulling together all of this evidence about the types of impacts that different researchers had observed. Next. Yeah, sorry about the contrast here. The colors are just like totally morphed. That's fascinating. So I think now awareness about impacts of recreation on wildlife is way up. So there's been a bunch of media articles about this over the last few years, and I generally get a much different reaction when I tell people about, my research on this topic. Next. But does that increased awareness go along with good management guidance and practices for how to minimize impact? I would say kind of, but not enough. We do have some pretty good guidance for how to plan and design trails and preserves. And that's thanks in part to some really great work from a lot of folks in Colorado that put together this guide. So, we do know something about how to identify and avoid placing trails in critical wildlife areas, and some ideas about how to minimize and mitigate impacts from new trails. But it's not necessarily typical to be designing a new trail network or new trail or preserve design from scratch. More commonly, managers are working in existing parks and public lands where they're facing increasing demands for recreation from a whole variety of user groups, while trying to balance that with their mandate to protect natural resources, including wildlife. Next slide. And unfortunately, we don't have great management guidance for that situation. So it's much harder to change or restrict existing use. People get really attached to their favorite trails and places and can react really strongly when access is limited. So this photo is from a protest that was held when some mountain bike trails were closed for habitat restoration in a park I was working in San Diego. If you press forward, Guinevere, I have a few bullet points here. You could probably do the next couple. Yeah, so that's kind of the human factor. And then there's also the fact that the science on how recreation really affects wildlife and what we can do to minimize impacts is still really unsettled and variable. There's a lot more research on this than there used to be, but studies point in a lot of different directions. A lot of wildlife studies are looking at behavioral responses of animals or changes in the way they use their habitat, and those studies are great. But it's hard to make a clear connection to wildlife population sizes and demographics, which is the things that managers are usually most concerned about. And then going back to that variability, there are so many things that can affect how wildlife respond to recreation. So the species, the time of year, what recreation activity, the group size and noise level and behavior of the people. In fact, I started drafting a conceptual diagram of all the factors I thought could affect it, and I'll flash it up here briefly for you. So next slide. And you can see that it very quickly started to get out of hand. So I'm going to spare you, but this is, I very quickly came up with 20 or 30 reasons why there could be variable responses. Next, yeah, so here's a specific example of that variability in research results. So I'm showing you two studies that both examined the responses of bobcats to recreation across a network of parks and open space preserves in the Bay Area. So same species, same location. You would hope and expect that we would get similar results. Yet, what we see is Reed and Marenlander found a dramatic reduction of bobcat detections in areas with recreation, and Riley et al. Found no effect of recreation on bobcat habitat use. And really there are some differences in study design, methodology, and the years when these studies took place. But overall, it's pretty head scratching and makes it really hard for managers to know what to do. Like, do we need to worry about bobcats or not? Next, yeah. So that being said, there are some themes that I think are fairly consistent across this noisy body of literature. First, predictability helps animals adapt. So that means that off-trail activities like backcountry skiing can be harder for animals to handle than something where they know where it's going to happen, like mountain biking and hiking that occurs on a trail. Second, animal sensitivity varies throughout the year, and typically the breeding season is when a lot of species are the most sensitive. So sometimes you'll see seasonal closures for that reason. Third, many mammals shift their daily activity patterns to be more active at night when humans typically aren't around. And that could be a really great way of partitioning up the day and limiting interactions with people, but it could also have a lot of consequences that we don't fully understand. And then the human footprint, so infrastructure, roads, buildings, has different impacts on wildlife than human presence. You can't necessarily assume that a species that avoids housing developments is going to avoid hiking trails. And then lastly, and this is also kind of an unfortunate one, wildlife traits like body size, trophic level, diet, etc., don't seem to be very good predictors of which species are going to be more sensitive to recreation than others. So with that, I'm going to shift and briefly touch on some of my thoughts about the future of outdoor recreation. Next slide. So first, climate change, which has already been brought up, and I think Angela will talk more about in the next presentation. But what I think about when I think of climate change effects is that I expect kind of a squeeze on both people and wildlife, meaning I think for people, recreation is going to shift into different season or times of day. So ski seasons are going to be shorter. Summertime activities are going to be limited to when it's not super hot or when there's not wildfire smoke. So I think there's going to be some degree of like concentrating when people are active. And I think the same thing may happen with wildlife. They're also wanting to avoid extreme heat, and they need to access resources that are only available during particular times of year, which might be shrinking or shifting. So I wonder if that squeeze is going to result in more overlap between people and wildlife. Next. I think we will see increasing diversification of the types of activities that people do outside. So this is an example of an electric mountain bike. I think we're going to keep seeing new technology that allows people to get more easily further into the backcountry. I think also with growing populations and growing participation in outdoor recreation, we'll probably see more crowding and less opportunities for solitude. So that might just be a mindset shift for a lot of people. And then taking those together, I think that it's probably going to become even harder for managers to understand the impacts of all of these different kinds of activities. In my opinion, that means we probably need to adopt somewhat of a precautionary principle of acknowledging that we're not going to fully understand the effects of every type of recreation on every species. So we probably need to keep some areas that are just for wildlife and not for recreation. Next. I've seen some thoughts recently about whether restoration and stewardship could be like a new way for people to recreate and connect with nature. And I think that would also provide positive benefits to the land and wildlife. I think there's a lot of potential there, and that's really exciting. I just learned about the Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, a group in Colorado, which sounds like they do really great work in this area. I think this is exciting. At the same time, I don't think it's probably going to take away from the demand for more traditional forms of recreation. And then I don't want to close out without talking a little bit about how vital outdoor recreation is, kind of what Chris touched on. I firmly believe that we need outdoor recreation, and we will probably need it even more in the future. I think we need to work to expand access to groups that haven't typically participated or been able to participate as much. So, I'm certainly not anti-recreation in any way. I just want to be conscious about impacts to wildlife and minimize them to the extent possible. So yeah, thank you for listening to my semi-random collection of thoughts, and look forward to the discussion.
Great, Courtney. That was a really great presentation, and that those skiers on that thin trail of snow was really hit home about like how everything will be squeezed. And so thank you for that. And I've been looking for lots of data on those conflicts, so you provided a lot of information. Thank you. Our final polling question is, How can universities and extension support communities looking to implement, add, or expand outdoor recreation? If you guys can take a few minutes and answer that, I'm going to queue up Dr. Angela Boag's slides, and she is the Climate Resiliency Policy Lead with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Take it away when you're ready.
Great, thanks. So thanks everybody for attending today. You can go to the next slide. So yeah, I work at Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I am the Climate Resiliency Policy Lead, which is a new position for our state agency. I started in this role about 1.5 years ago, but I've been with the state for over 5 years now. And I'm really excited that CPW, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, has this position, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I do. For any students in the audience, I had a sort of research background, before coming into policy work. I did a master's in forest and conservation sciences at the University of British Columbia, and then did my PhD at CU Boulder, looking at climate change impacts on forests and sort of the wildfire nexus as well. So next slide. So in my current role with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, really my job is to integrate climate change considerations into all of the planning and programmatic work that our agency does. We are a pretty big state agency. We both are the state wildlife agency in Colorado, but then we also play a pretty big role in recreation. We manage 43 state parks and over 350 state wildlife areas where people can hunt, fish, do wildlife viewing, all of that kind of thing. So a lot of property to manage, and obviously we're a state with a huge recreation economy and a lot of people getting out there, both folks who live in the state and lots of visitors. Our state government, I would say, is quite progressive on climate change. Under this current state administration, we have a statewide climate preparedness roadmap, which really addresses climate change impacts to really every sector of the economy and communities across the state, including, thinking about wildlife and recreation. And so it's really my job to implement, aspects of that plan for this agency. We also do statewide comprehensive recreation planning. That's our SCORP that we just wrapped up a new version of. And we also are updating our state wildlife action plan this year. So all of those types of planning efforts, it's my job to really, sort of peer into the future, work with climate scientists, and think about how we maybe need to change our sort of business as usual as the climate continues to change. So next slide. So I think Jeff and others already provided some great background on climate change. So I'll keep this brief, but, despite, I think, the direction of the current federal administration here in the US, climate change is happening, and it's going to continue to happen. This graph just shows that we're now over 420 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which is higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years, really since human ancestors came on the scene. So it's a pretty unprecedented change in the amount of greenhouse gases that are in our atmosphere. Next slide. And, scientists understand this relationship between greenhouse gas concentrations and temperature pretty well. There's certainly still some uncertainty, and different models produce different forecasts, but at the end of the day, we understand that it has been warming and it will continue to warm. And so I think Jeff might have shown this figure or a similar one, but that black line on the graph shows observed temperature, and the orange squiggles are modeled projections for temperature into the future. So you can see that our observations, unfortunately, are tracking the predictions that climate scientists are making pretty well. So we've gained, basically 3 degrees Fahrenheit here in Colorado since 1900, and we'll see another 1 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit of warming by sort of the middle to end of the century, depending on, how things play out. I will point folks in Colorado and elsewhere to the Climate Change in Colorado report that came out last year from CSU, from our climate center. It's an awesome report, and it has lots of great highlights in there. But I know when we talk about climate change, sometimes the degrees, the numbers, they're not very easy to interpret. So I love that this report has tried to apply a narrative to some of these changes. So one way to think about the level of warming is that by 2050, the average year is likely to be as warm as the very warmest years on record. This is in Colorado through 2022. And by 2070, the average year is likely to be warmer than the very warmest years through 2022. So if you sort of think back, to the last 10 years, if you've lived in this state, if you think about those really hot summers we've had, really dry conditions, bad wildfire risk, that's unfortunately going to be the norm by sort of the middle to end of the century. So that's maybe one way to internalize like what these changes are going to look like. Next slide. I always think it's really important to consider public opinion if you're working on climate change, because obviously this differs massively depending on where you are in the US and where you are in the world. One resource I really love that I encourage everybody to check out if you're working on climate at all is the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication. I put the link in the chat there. You can look at climate opinions of the public at the state level, at the county level, even at the level of a congressional district. So you can really drill down, and there's a QR code on this page too. In Colorado, the vast majority of Coloradans believe that global warming is happening. A smaller proportion agree that it is caused mostly by human activities, which is a scientific consensus, but it's still a majority. And so at least in Colorado, there's a lot of comfort talking about climate change and a lot of public concern. But I realize that's not the same everywhere. Next slide. So what am I worried about in my role, and specifically thinking about recreation? And Jeff, I think, teed this question up really well. I'm going to list off a few things. Okay, number one is heat waves, and we've already spoken to this a little bit. This plot here is from that Climate Change in Colorado report. It's not the easiest to interpret, but I'll explain it. So this is the projected number of 4-day heat waves per decade, and how that will change over this century. I think the easiest way to think about it is that in the year 2000, if you experienced one 4-day heat wave of temps over 95 degrees in the Denver area, for example, by the end of the century, you may see 40 days over 95. So we're really looking at potentially like a 10x in the number of days that we would consider sort of heat wave days, at least in Colorado, in most areas by the end of the century. But obviously, if you're in a mountain community, your heat waves are going to be cooler, right? They're only going to be in the 80s potentially, whereas on the Eastern Plains, we're going to see a lot more temps in the hundreds. Okay, next slide. Extreme heat, right? So I just spoke to heat waves. Heat in general, I think, is going to change recreation a lot. So I think as Courtney teed up, it's going to change when people recreate. So early mornings, evenings in certain areas, but it's probably also going to put more visitation pressure on mountain communities that are cooler, which is obviously going to have a lot of impacts. It's going to exacerbate some of the overuse, over-visitation challenges we're having, and also potentially place more stress on wildlife who are, also using some of those like cooler areas of habitat in the summer. It also is going to have really big implications for aquatic wildlife and habitat. Here in Colorado, we already implement both voluntary and mandatory fishing closures on certain waterways, rivers, streams, when temps are too high, because a lot of cold water fish like trout just are very stressed by higher water temperatures. If you're thinking about, if you're an agency, work for an agency, thinking about what to do about this, a simple thing we've started doing is actually taking more rigorous records of when we do these voluntary and mandatory closures. We actually had not been keeping those records very accurately. So we're at least starting to track like how often that's happening and what the trends are over time. Next slide. So again, I think Jeff and others teed this up really well. I think we're also going to see some challenges with the contracting winter recreation season. And interesting, in the Rocky Mountains, some research suggests that we'll fare quite a bit better than other areas of the country. We might lose another sort of 20 or 30 days by the middle of the century in our ski season, or towards the end of the century. But that's a lot better than, for instance, the Pacific Northwest, where they may see reductions of up to 2 to 3 months in their ski season by the end of the century. And so it's obviously too early to say how this will affect places like Colorado and Wyoming. We either may see just even more winter rec pressure from those places that have lost opportunities, or maybe fewer people will ski overall. It's a little hard to say at this point. Next slide. So yeah, just running through a couple other challenges I see, again, with that decreasing and shifting snowpack and earlier peak runoff. We are also going to be seeing those shoulder seasons expanding. So people are able to get out into the backcountry earlier in the year, and then also later into the fall because it'll be warmer and less snow on the ground. We'll also see earlier peak stream flows and earlier low flow or low water level conditions, which are obviously going to change like how aquatic recreation, water-based recreation happens. And again, I think potentially put people in conflict with wildlife who need that resource as well. And I'm not the only one worried about these things. Our Colorado Climate Preparedness Roadmap, which is put out by our governor's climate preparedness office, really goes through all of these challenges that the state is going to experience as well. Next slide. Fire risk, this has already been mentioned as well. We're going to experience more frequent fire bans, in response, I think, and maybe increased resource demands that local agencies see in terms of identifying and putting out, illegal campfires, which can be, a really frequent source of wildfire ignitions. People are often what starts wildfires these days in the West, especially. Next slide. Okay, so what are we doing about all of this? And if folks are on the call who are working for similar agencies or have a role in potentially doing planning work, this is what we're doing. So we are contemplating a climate vulnerability assessment for Colorado state parks and state wildlife areas. So we have state park plans that are updated about every 10 years, but they currently don't rigorously think about climate change impacts. So we are going to work on identifying potentially vulnerable infrastructure. So these could be things like roads that are vulnerable to more extreme storm events and erosion, culverts that need to be right-sized, even buildings that don't have air conditioning that need it, boat ramps that aren't meeting the water because our reservoir levels are too low too frequently. Like that's also a challenge we're experiencing. And then also thinking about how operations might need to change. Are we relying on seasonal staffers in areas where we may need full-time staff more often because we're seeing more use in the spring and the fall, for example. We've applied for some federal funding to do this work. Who knows if we will see that funding come through. We may not, but we'll figure out another way, I think, to get it done. And then we're also working with the National Park Service. Their climate change response program has developed a pretty straightforward way of getting climate future data and doing these climate summaries for individual national parks, and they're open to us using the same tool for our state parks. So if you work for a state park agency, that could be an opportunity for you too. Next slide. A couple other resources I wanted to highlight. This is a really cool adaptation workbook from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It was originally developed for forests, but they have a recreation adaptation menu as well. And I'll probably be able to share out these slides so you can have these links. Next slide. But what's really cool about it is it's based on some research that actually use some case studies to identify specific climate adaptation opportunities for different recreation sites and like different contexts. So this example that I'll share briefly is it's like a riparian area in California that sees a lot of human use in the summer when it's really hot. And so they worked with the managers there to talk about recreation climate adaptation approaches. And they came up with all kinds of things, like everything from, and you can see in this table, building like vault toilets that are built with lighter colors to just reduce temperatures inside, so that the public can use them, safely. But then also things like contemplating building another like water play area at the same site, like a splash pad, to just take the pressure off of this riparian area and redirect people elsewhere. And then even like, changing their staffing, that third item there, to be available for really heavy use periods and have, staff available for law enforcement if needed. So this is the kind of exercise that I think anybody can really go through who's managing a whole program or a site to be thinking about their vulnerabilities. Next slide. Great. And so I'll wrap up here with just a couple other, sort of key messages around actions. The research is out there that really suggests that fear and loss focused messages around climate change can really turn people off. It can cause people to withdraw and really paralyze folks. So it's important to give people specific actions that empower them, to address some of these climate change impacts. So that can be everything from citizen science projects like our Colorado Pika project, to get people involved in monitoring species that might be vulnerable to climate change, to, reminding folks that some of our existing good practices like staying on the trail, leave no trace practices are potentially even more important with climate change, to give species and habitats a break from other impacts. And then the last thing I would say is I think one trend we'll see will be agencies like mine needing to maybe provide more information to help people make safe decisions as the climate changes. So like this sign here is an example, I think from Arizona, city of Phoenix, educating people about heat-related illness and what they need, to do a hike when conditions are, when temperatures are a certain level. And I think more and more places will need to think about like signage like this or other education opportunities. Next slide. One other resource I'll point to, the Society of Outdoor Recreation Professionals had an awesome webinar series this past summer on climate resilient recreation, with everything from like designing trails that are climate resilient to thinking about fire resilience as well. So if you're not a member, check out that organization and you can get access to their webinars. Next slide. And then, I would just really empower all of you to be thinking about the greatest climate vulnerabilities in your community or, the local systems you work in and what adaptation opportunities might look like, but also mitigation. Are there opportunities that you have some control over to reduce emissions, using your sphere of influence, encouraging carpooling, all that good stuff to help us, deal with the climate challenge. Next slide. All right, so there are those resources that I shared. Again, we'll see if we can share these slides out so you have access to all of those, but happy to answer any questions now, or feel free to contact me after this presentation. So thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angela. I thought that was really interesting. You kind of brought everything together at the end there, people, places, and the economy. And so thank you for tying all of those great conversations that we had together today. We are going to summarize the third and fourth polling questions, since I forgot to do that last time. Go ahead, Haley, and summarize what people said.
Awesome. Well, first, I want to say thank you to all of our people who are jumped on this webinar today and answered some of our polling questions. You are not just shooting these out into the universe. These are coming back to Guinevere and I, helping us to make sure that we are supporting the outdoor recreation industry as best as we can from University and the Extension side of things. So thank you for that. So I'm going to kind of work backwards so we can get back to like what people are curious about, because I think that's going to really kick off our Q&A section. But first up, about how universities and Extension can support communities looking to implement outdoor recreation. There was a lot of comments about support through grants and guidance for planning efforts, providing tools for communities being able to access data, as well as just being able to best help communicate all of this information that we've collected throughout this webinar and other topics as well, and getting that out to our communities. Somebody said education is key, and so I think that really sums up kind of what everybody had said within that question. Our third question, excuse me, was what resources do you need to make outdoor recreation efforts resilient in the future? We had some comments that said good continued communication with public and local communities. Some people said funding, money. We know that that is a big challenge that a lot of communities and organizations face. And then some other people said that the more that they learn, the more that they realize that it'd be great if there was a place for a big knowledge-based clearinghouse for all of this wonderful information that we've been chatting about. And so before I kick it on over to Guinevere for the Q&A, I know we've got some few questions coming up, but some other ones that we might be able to throw in there, just what some people had said that they are curious about for the future. There were some questions about how technology can be integrated and facilitated into the growth of outdoor recreation, how we can balance economic development with concerns for housing affordability, overcrowding, etc. Just basic best practices for the future of developing outdoor recreation in communities that maybe didn't have recreation before that. Any new and exciting opportunities that anyone knows about, and then a lot of concerns about the trajectory of the federal government protecting public lands and how to prepare for that. But yes, just a lot of really great questions. Thank you again all for submitting your answers to our questions. They really help us as we are continuing to develop any resources and other things coming out from the universities and other organizations. So with that, I will pass that back on over to Guinevere to jump into our Q&A portion. And I want to remind everyone that we do have a few prepared questions, but if there's any other questions that come up for you, please feel free to use the Q&A or I believe the chat. Either one should work. And so we can throw those in there to get our panelists' wonderful expertise on.
I would just open it up to panelists first if you wanted to respond to any of those things that Haley mentioned as what people are curious about. If anything triggered anything. Okay, cool. I think you guys hit on a lot of the questions that we were submitted to and some that Haley and I came up with on our own. I think we all kind of talked about this, but I would be curious if you could provide some more information on this question, which is, with the increase in natural disasters and drought, what do you think outdoor recreation will look like in 15 years? And I think anybody can answer that, but Angela, if you wanted to hit that one first, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I can kick us off. Yeah, I think it's hard to say. I think humans are extremely adaptable. And so that always makes it a little tricky to sort of predict exactly how things are going to change. Obviously, depending on what type of natural disaster it is, it can have huge impacts on a sort of local community, right? Wildfires, obviously a huge one. Some of the big wildfires we have had recently in Colorado, for instance, the 2020 ones, had lasting impacts on recreation areas. Trails were closed because of hazardous trees, wildfire debris flows, waterways, some of our streams and rivers experienced big impacts from post-fire flooding and turbidity and even fish kills, killing some of our trout in those streams and really, taking away the options for fishing, in some of these areas. So, but, ecosystems do recover. And I think most of those areas impacted by some of the big fires we saw in 2020 are open again, for recreation opportunities here, 5 years later, I guess. So I do think there's always going to be opportunities for resilience and for areas to rebound. I think, I just think that every recreation focused community does need to understand that, especially if they're in a fire-prone area, that it's not really a question of if, but when. And, does the community have the resources in place to respond, sort of effectively, rapidly, and then assist with whatever sort of rebuilding or, or rehabilitation and restoration is going to need to happen. And then I do think, though, that some of the other climate-related challenges are just going to be more chronic and challenging over the long term. So, with those contracting snow seasons, more frequent and extreme drought conditions, I think outfitters, ski companies, et cetera, are going to have to, modify their business and adapt long term. And I think a ton of them already are, right? Like the ski industry especially has been at the forefront of this forever. One of the reasons I think a lot of them are expanding mountain bike access and mountain bike trails, for example, is because they recognize that more of their business may need to come from the shoulder and summer seasons in the future. So yeah, I think it looks really different depending on what aspect of the rec economy and you're active in and where you are.
Anyone else want to tackle that question, or can I move on to the next? Okay, great. I was curious if you guys could talk about what are some current gaps in knowledge on outdoor recreation, and what could you identify what those are and how that could add to the overall understanding of the impacts of outdoor recreation in Wyoming and Colorado?
I can jump in here just from our perspective, where we look quite heavily at the economic impact of outdoor rec, and the US Bureau of Economic Analysis provides this great data on the national and state level, but it's quite limited when you drill down to the regional, county, and local level. And that's really where the rubber hits the road on building strategic plans around expanding outdoor recreation. Where are people going? What assets need most support? And where are people concentrated? And what that leads to is some more well-resourced communities doing local economic impact studies on outdoor recreation, but those that are often rural and less resourced don't have access to that data. So it's hard to build on something you don't have a baseline for. So I think there's a big opportunity to get better economic impact data at the regional and local level. And there's actually a cool announcement out of Wisconsin recently, and I'm going to butcher the name, but it's something called the Do-It-Yourself Economic Impact of Outdoor Recreation Analysis. And they basically developed a framework for communities to learn about the impact of outdoor recreation in their boundaries, and they profiled like maybe 4 or 5 communities. So the economic impact for sure. And then on top of that, technology around things like cell phone data and where that's clustered in terms of time of day and where and what types of recreation activity, I think would go such a long way, especially toward addressing some of the human wildlife conflicts that came up in Courtney's remarks, to understand how humans are behaving and what we can do to mitigate impacts. So I think those are a couple opportunities.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Chris there that one of the challenges in understanding recreation's impact on wildlife is, some recreation areas are a lot easier to understand where recreation is happening than others. Like, a park with one gated entrance where people pay a fee, like it's pretty easy to count how many people go in and out during the course of the day. But if you think about Forest Service land or BLM land where people can kind of just like access it from wherever, it's really hard to know like where people are going and where the highest concentrations of use are. So definitely things like cell phone data would help a lot. Other gaps in knowledge on the wildlife front, I think, are really testing some of the interventions to minimize impacts. So, we are seeing a lot of places implement like seasonal closures, maybe winter closures to protect wildlife during the winter season, or climbing areas that close down during raptor nesting season. I haven't seen a lot of like empirical studies that really say how well is that working. So I think that's something that could be a big area for research in the future.
Great, that's really nice, and it ties well to Chris's comments. That's really great. I like getting to like how all of these intersect. So thanks for your comments. I guess we have kind of danced around this question, but I think mostly people are, how do we balance the demand for outdoor rec and the evolving conservation efforts? I know that Dr. Boag said some things about like leave no trace, and stewardship was a strategy that we should be emphasizing. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I was speaking with the superintendent of Grand Teton National Park the other day, and he said one of the biggest concerns he has is the bandwidth in his parks for stewards. And I sort of like pressed him on that. Like, do you mean like friends groups or staff? And he meant everyone. He meant from the people who work for the federal government to the friends groups and volunteers to the people who recreate outdoors in the general public. And he noted that user behavior has changed quite a bit. I think in the era of social media, people are tending to get off the beaten path more often, to have that really memorable experience. They're perhaps engaging in more risk-taking behavior. And if you have more people getting outdoors and that percentage of people doing risky or egregious things is increasing just a little bit, the number of incidents is going to increase dramatically. And so for me, the question is, how do we imbue users with a stewardship ethic from the start? Because we can't just rely on people to experience a place and know what to do and know that it's worth protecting. It actually requires quite a bit of interpretation from environmental educators and professionals who can say, this is how we interact with a place properly and how we can be stewards in the long term and what our behavior does. That's not just learned by default. So that comment from the superintendent really stuck with me about integrating stewardship across all our activities, and we'll be looking for solutions to find good results.
I guess what came to mind for me on that question was, I do see differences on the wildlife impact side in areas with, good quality habitat that's well connected to other habitat. I think, wildlife are better able to handle impacts of various kinds. So, I think like in thinking about balancing recreation and conservation, like, in areas where we want to try to minimize recreation impacts, like what can we do to restore habitat or improve habitat quality for species that we're concerned about? Because it does make a difference in animals' ability to kind of weather those disturbances.
And I'll just chime in too. I think there's a really important role to play for local governments and like local planning entities, because, while when it comes to our federal lands, obviously there's a huge responsibility for the federal government to, maintain habitat connectivity, maintain at least a certain level of conservation priority, for some federal lands. But then I would say, at the local level, empowering local decision makers, local planners with the tools they need to, understand how development decisions might impact connectivity for wildlife, thinking about the best place, to potentially put new recreation opportunities from that sort of conservation perspective in terms of balancing, rec opportunities and conservation, I think is really powerful because most planning decisions that have yet to be made are happening at that local level.
Great. Thank you guys. I really like the empowering people piece. I think that really gives me hope for collective action. We have an interesting question in the chat and I wanted to give it to you all to answer. In our city, we received a complaint from a neighbor that our development of additional outdoor trails was going to harm wildlife. Although I think his comment may have been from a standpoint of not wishing to have people on city land next to his property, it did nonetheless leave us with this question. How would we properly address his statement?
I can take the first stab at that one. I mean, I think without knowing more about the context, it's pretty hard to say like what impacts on wildlife might be happening. But I guess more broadly, I would say this gets to like a little bit of more of a values question of like, we know that recreation has impacts on wildlife. So probably, developing these additional trails, you can't really say that it's not going to have any impact. But it's like, a question of, well, you're adding trails that are going to be for the public good and are going to positively impact X number of people. Depending on how severe of an impact to wildlife you think it will cause, like that's really a judgment and values call about I don't know. That's probably not very helpful, but that's the way I would think about it.
That's kind of how I was thinking about it too. Like, there are no silver bullets in this world. There's no solution that's perfect for all parties. And in this person's case, I would approach the question as like, we have an opportunity here to bring great benefits to our community and connect to one another and improve public health and quality of life. And according to research like Courtney's, there could also be impacts on wildlife. And so how do we want to approach that? Is it possible that we could increase trail access here and find a place that is actually little used and take down a trail that is not in use and expand wildlife habitat elsewhere? Is it possible that we could display signage at the trailhead about how to properly interact with wildlife and mitigate one's impact? Is it possible that we could partner with a local youth education organization and do programming on how to be a good steward of our public lands and waters, so we're raising a next generation that helps limit impacts on wildlife? I think using that opportunity to engage in a conversation about like, how can we get the best of all worlds out of this, rather than turning it into a binary, either a yes or no, because that's where people can really dig in their heels.
I really wish there was a silver bullet, but I think it's really important to say that because it does. It is a challenge, one of those wicked problems or wicked challenges that will take lots of solutions in different places. So thanks for that. We have about 9 minutes left, so I think I was going to leave us on a positive note. One of the questions was that if you guys could provide tips for accepting things out of your control, legislation, stakeholder input, climate change, what would those tips be so that people can continue to have positive outlooks on this challenging Colorado and Wyoming?
And all of a sudden it feels like a therapy session. This is a big question, but I do have some thoughts. And one is that more things are actually in our control than we realize. And, I suspect this question is in relation to the state of the federal government, change in administration, and the sort of speed with which new actions are being taken. And while it may feel powerless to watch that from afar, like that occurrence didn't happen from happenstance. The people who wanted to see that change in the world were very organized and came together and developed an agenda and pushed it forward. And that takes a lot of people in communities, in small groups, sharing their values. And so if you have values that are important to you, that often starts at the local level. The payoffs can oftentimes be years down the line. But it is real people coming together and stating principles that does create change on things like outdoor recreation, conservation, climate change, and otherwise. So it's important not to be discouraged. The pendulum shifts in one direction or another throughout history, and there will be openings in the future for things that maybe feel more aligned with your values in politics. So don't despair, and find a community locally that can help you scale up your values with the people you love.
Yeah, I'll add on to that, specifically thinking about climate change, because I know it can feel huge and overwhelming. There's actually really good research out there that shows that when people do take an action on climate change, any action really, it doesn't have to be huge. It really reduces their climate anxiety. So I just I'm using empower a lot, but I encourage everybody on the call to do things as simple as just talking about climate change with your peers, with your family, etc. That's super valuable. But then, there's so much that you can do. And I think one of the most powerful things is getting engaged in your community and pushing for policy changes, either at the local or the state level, because sometimes or often you will get a lot more traction at those levels, and you can often honestly have like one-on-one conversations with decision makers. So I'd really encourage that.
Yeah, I guess my thought lately is to do two things: be active as it suits you as best as you can. What engages you to be active and organizing or advocating for some sort of change. And for me personally, the second part of that is my mantra is nothing is worth sacrificing your state of mind. if you don't have that, you don't have anything. You're off kilter, and you're not serving anybody. You're not doing anybody any good, including yourself, especially. So nothing is worth sacrificing your state of mind.
Gotta keep on keeping on, right? Excuse me. Great. So I just wanted to say thank you to the panelists. I was so excited about this one. Thank you so much. It met and exceeded my expectations on the information and just connecting all those pieces of outdoor recreation that are important in the economy, the environment, and the people. And I just thank you so much for your expertise and your time today. As we close out this last one, I really would love feedback in the Q&A if you have the time, or if you have any to help us make these better. We hope to expand and bring in new topics next year. And this has just been such a great experience for us, Haley and I. We've loved this. So thank you everyone for your contributions and your participation. I wanted to say that if you have an interest in this recording or the slides, we can get those to you upon request to either of our emails. And this will live on the University of Wyoming Worth Institute page if you want to navigate there, and you can see all of our other recordings over there. So with that, Haley, do you have any final thoughts before we close out?
No, I don't. Just thank you again to our panelists. You guys have been wonderful, such a wealth of knowledge. And thank you to all of you who have attended, as well as many of you who have attended our past webinars. Yes, like Guinevere said, please get us any topics or anything else that you would be interested in. Please feel free to reach out to either of us. There will also be a survey that comes out to your email tomorrow, I believe, where you can add some more comments in there as well. Just thank you again. We have so enjoyed this, and thank you, Guinevere, for your support on this and these crazy ideas that we've had together. So thank you all, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I'll give you 4 minutes back of your day, and look forward to seeing you on the trails or on the slopes or in the water. See you later.